This week on the right side, an Alberta NDP bill creating a new time zone is defeated. The BC NDP replaced big money donations with taxpayer money. The Fed's small business tax changes affect millions of Canadians. And a fake story from Victoria garners international media outrage. This is The Right Side, episode 35, recorded Saturday, September 23rd, 2017, keeping time, taxation, and the media in line. Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Right Side. This week, Patrick and myself are back, as we are every week. Welcome back.
Good to be back, and lots of interesting news to talk about this week. Certainly some that are slightly stranger than others, but, it's good to be back as well.
Indeed it is. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go through some news stories, and we're going to cut through the bias, sensationalism, and other nonsense that appears in them, and try to get through to some of the truth of what's being talked about in these. I think this is going to be a week where we start rather innocuous and end up heading towards something that's a little bit head scratching, wouldn't you say?
I would say we start at the innocuous and head towards the ridiculous. That's what I would go with.
All right. Well, let us begin. We're going to start off in Alberta this week, and the headline is as follows. Committee decides Albertans should keep changing their clocks twice a year. So in the spring session this year of the legislature, a private member's bill was introduced to abandon daylight savings time by NDP rookie backbencher Thomas Dang. An all-party committee was reviewing the bill, and this past Tuesday made the recommendation to the government that the bill should be abandoned. The bill would have had Alberta create a new time zone, Alberta Standard Time. The new time zone would have effectively put Alberta on Central Standard Time all year round. We would be 1 hour ahead of you in BC in the summer and 2 hours ahead of BC in the winter. That's a little bit odd choosing to align with Central Time rather than Pacific Time, but the story gets more interesting. A survey was run over the summer, gained about 13,000 responses, and so far, 75% of them were in favor of the time change. But when the in-person hearings began, the opposite response was true. 69 of 113 submissions at the in-person hearings were against the idea of changing the time. So therefore, around 60% or so were against changing time. There are many reasons why people are for or against this bill, and one of them is that the sun would not rise until 1 hour later in the winter, as we're currently accustomed to. And businesses, including the Oilers and the Flames, both oppose the time change because that meant that their Saturday night hockey games could start as late as 9:30 p.m. WestJet also expressed concern that their Calgary operation would suffer as a result of the change. Recall that WestJet is the Canadian airline based in Calgary that serves through much of North America and now Europe as well. So while the NDP likely thought that this would be a simple change to change the time zone for Alberta, it's proven to be anything but simple. The sentiment expressed by MLA Dang in the spring was that he was hearing from Albertans left, right, and center that they were in favor of the time change. Thus, the sense is given to the media at the time that it would be a simple procedure to make the time change. This past week, however, Premier Rachel Notley said that the issue is still on the table, and it could be addressed in the fall session. It's unclear at this point if this is her intention to bring up the issue in the fall session, or if she is just using this language to avoid the issue and not render a decision that would be seen as premature and perhaps unfavorable to those in favor of changing our time zone. She later expanded on this by saying that, quote, there are some good points that were raised, and I think there's more research and work that has to be done around it. There were some good comments, good considerations that were raised about economic impact, and so it's important to dig into that a little bit more. And now that's the key point here. You see, this story is actually talking about economic impact, and the Premier rightly points that out. So that's well done right there. At the end of the day, this issue can be seen as a microcosm for the entire NDP government. The government is still new and inexperienced and often acts without fully understanding the ramifications of their policy. So the path forward for this policy looks to be one where Alberta will advocate across Canada and North America to modify or do away with daylight savings time in general, because the sentiment that was received is that, if we're going to do this, it should definitely be something that's done across jurisdictions. Because if you look at Alberta and specifically where Edmonton and Calgary sit, our closest port city is Vancouver. And there's tons of freight that flies into Edmonton and Calgary, and even more so now, using Edmonton as a hub for Alaska and Iceland, even for freight. So you look at that and the time where that would be linked compared to the time in Vancouver, it kind of doesn't really make sense to be aligning ourselves with Saskatchewan when it might make more sense to align with the major port in Vancouver at various times throughout the year. So there's going to be more work done across this on an interprovincial barrier.
Yeah, and what doesn't make any sense is that they're trying to align with the central time zone, whereas why don't they just try and align with the mountain time zone and then just do away with daylight savings time so that you end up being 1 hour ahead most of the year and then being 0 ahead. I believe that's what
BC,
Arizona
right?
does. Yeah,
Right.
that's what Arizona
That is what
does in the
Arizona
United
does.
States.
Yeah.
And even parts of Saskatchewan are part of the Mountain Standard Time Zone, so that would kind of work for them too. So it's kind of odd that this is what's put forward as what seems to be a priority for this NDP government. I mean, sure, it was created by a backbencher, but it seems like it's something that the government was wanting to go for anyways, and that they were wanting to explore.
I mean, it's very rare that a backbench MLA's, let alone a rookie backbench MLA's bill gets to the point of committee where it's being debated and potentially adopted as law. So, they did go really far with this. And, the thing I find, two things that are very interesting about this is the discrepancy in responses. 13,000 responses through an online survey, 75% in favor. But when it comes to actual committee reporting in person, that reverses to 60% being opposed to it. So that's a little bit odd right there, figuring out where that's coming from. And of course, the second thing on this regards to the media angle is that it was largely focused in on the economic impacts, towards the hockey teams and the Calgary Flames, for example. But it also, this is something that is going to affect everyone. We are very far north here in Alberta, to the point where, if we were to adopt some of these changes, it would not get light in the winter until close to 9 a.m. in the morning. And I can imagine some people not being happy with that. And when daylight savings was first introduced in the 1970s, it was actually brought in by plebiscite. So if this kind of thing is to happen, maybe it's only fair to go about removing it the same way it was brought in. And some discussions were done on that, and it would only cost the province between $2 and $6 million to carry out a referendum on this if they wanted to. So there's also that. And I think the other issue that's not really being discussed here is that, the Premier mentions economic impact, but at the end of the day, that is what ultimately needs to be considered here. So anyways, I don't think it's likely to go ahead at this point, but you never know what might happen. It might still get adopted, but given the fact it was shot down by 100% unanimous vote at committee across all parties, I don't think it will be being adopted. No.
But as we say in politics, you never know what's going to happen until you wake up tomorrow, right? Something new can happen overnight, and you never know.
That's right. So what do you got for BC with us this week?
Well, that's actually a pretty nice segue, because when we went to bed on, I believe it was Tuesday night, and then woke up the next day, we had discovered that the NDP actually were finally rolling along with one of their major platform promises, and one of the most contentious issues of the May election, and that was, of course, the banning of corporate and union donations. So it's what the NDP were calling, quote, getting big money out of politics. And they were kind of able to successfully portray the BC Liberals as the party of the rich and bought and paid for by corporations. And it's kind of one of the reasons why the NDP ended up in the position they were after the election, and that is being able to form a minority government with an agreement from the Green Party. Um, it's something that actually garnered international news attention with like a huge expose in the New York Times of all publications, saying
New
that
York
BC
Times.
was the Wild West of campaign
Right, I remember
donations,
that headline.
and that anyone in BC could donate any amount, and that corporations and unions all donated to all of the parties. Uh, and there was no limits on anything, and that's why they called it the Wild West. So, getting big money out of politics was something that I think rankled a lot of voters, and they're wanting to see limits imposed so that the governments aren't basically bought and paid for. Um, so the NDP, of course, they ended up, being able to form a minority government, and they had an agreement with the Green Party. So what that agreement entails and what exactly the NDP will pass in the legislature because of the agreement, well, we just don't really know that just yet. But with this bill, union and corporation donations will be banned, and individual contributions will be capped at 1,200. However, it's clear that with how the NDP are getting big money out of politics, is that the Green Party will benefit the most. And you can say, well, how could that be? And it's because instead of donations, political parties are going to be partially funded directly from taxpayer money. Yes, every BC taxpayer is now going to be paying for the government and the opposition parties to bombard us with attack ads during hockey games, ruin lawns with ugly wooden signs, and travel around the province for photo hops during election season. And it's what's being called in the media as a way to, quote, help wean the province's main political parties off of corporate and union donations, as if these donations are some sort of addiction. The NDP government announced that the taxpayers' contribution to these political parties will be in excess of $27 million over the next 4 years.
And is
So
that for all the parties or just one of them?
That's for all of the parties.
Okay.
Yeah, so each party will get $2.50 for each vote it garnered in the last provincial election, and that'll end up dropping to $1.75 in 2022. And that works out to almost 20 million over the 5 years. And there's also going to be a second set of payments, which totals another 11 million, which is framed as a set of, quote, reimbursements for money spent in the 2021 election. And at least $2.82 million of the total amount will be going to the Green Party, which, of course, as we know, they only have 3 MLAs out of, oh goodness, I should remember this number. It's in the 80s or something. So they've only got, say, less than 10%, but they're going to be getting a huge chunk of this 11 million that's going to go to them. And it's also a number that they wouldn't normally be able to achieve through conventional fundraising. And the NDP and the Liberals would stand to get about 6.75 million each of that number. So at a news conference where, of course, questions weren't allowed, Premier Horgan gushed about his party's new way to spend money. He said, quote, "Today, we are getting big money out of politics in British Columbia. The Wild West of the past will come to an end. This bill is what we campaigned on." Of course, it's not actually the bill they campaigned on, as before the election, Horgan said that he would not include taxpayer subsidies in any bill about campaign finance reform, and that it would be individuals that would be contributing. Of course, opposition critic Andrew Wilkinson of the BC Liberals announced Monday that he and his colleagues would vote against the parts of the bill that provided the taxpayer subsidies. Of course, he didn't say that if the NDP Green majority approves the funding anyways, that the Liberals would refuse to take it on a matter of principle. You might remember that in Manitoba, they tried the NDP government there tried the same thing, and the progressive conservative government in Manitoba, or the opposition at the time, they did refuse to take the money. So we'll see if the BC Liberals are going to do the same thing. I mean, we'll have to wait and see if the bill actually passes. However, I think there's something else about this, of course, and that's surrounding this whole story. The media is focusing more on the previous attempts by the then opposition NDP to change the bill and the Liberal refusal to do so. I think it's undeniable that the Liberals were greedy in soaking up these huge corporate donations for years, and but of course the NDP weren't blameless as well, because they were holding huge fundraisers at the same time as well. Just instead of huge corporations, it was powerful trade unions. And the reason why it's taken so much time for this campaign finance bill to be introduced is because the NDP was busy holding a few last $500 head cash for access fundraisers this month to squeeze out as many dollars as they could before their own changes made that illegal. So essentially, it almost seems like this is a way for the NDP to appease the Green Party to keep their agreement alive whilst giving them free taxpayers' money. I mean, it's basically a slap in the face to all British Columbians, especially the middle class and the working class, who will now have higher taxes to subsidize the NDP's high spending practices.
Oh boy, the language used in this report, how it uses the term wean, it's almost as though, we're going to wean them off of this bad thing that is in place right now, but it doesn't necessarily mention that what's going there is worse, because it's a taxpayer subsidy that everyone has to pay. You can't not do it now.
Mm-hmm.
It's a part of your taxation, and you have no choice about if you are paying for that portion of the government expenditures when you pay taxes. And it's just a transfer of funds from one area to another. And I think in that regard we were really lucky in the first conservative minority government federally when corporate and union donations were banned there, because that was a minority government and they got the support to do that. And then later on, the per vote subsidy also disappeared on a federal level, where, if a party gets a certain number of votes, they get a certain dollar amount for those votes. So very lucky federally that was able to disappear. And that is the approach that should have been taken in BC. But obviously, like you said, it seems to be a way of keeping the Green agreement alive here to, I guess, give money to the Green Party, because that's a disproportionate amount, isn't it?
That is a very disproportionate amount. And I mean, they had the Harper legislation that made corporate and union donations illegal, and also didn't have a voter subsidy in there. They basically made it so that political parties had to do their own fundraising and survive on their own without any help. And I think in a sense that's a good thing to do, because it means that if you're popular and you're able to get donations and survive, that means that you're more legitimate in the eyes of the Canadian electorate.
Right.
And by the BC Liberals, they had majorities for years since 2001, and they could have changed this at any time since then. But what they were doing is they were almost too greedy in soaking up the huge corporate donations, and they didn't really want to change it at all because they were too busy benefiting from it. And of course, the NDP, they were able to take the high road on this issue, and now they look really good, even though they're actually giving themselves more money in that case, because it's not coming from the unions or the corporations, but it's coming from every British Columbian who pays taxes now. And I think that's almost worse.
Right.
I
And
mean,
I'm betting that's a part also in the media that's being neglected here.
yeah, it is indeed. And people are talking about it quite a bit, in that the NDP are changing the rules and that the Wild West is over, but they're not mentioning how every taxpayer is now going to be paying for this. I mean, yeah, we need to get corporation and union donations out. That's a good thing. This is the good thing about this. But the bad thing is that they replaced it with taxpayer money, and that's not a good thing. It's almost like they were trying to couch the good news with a little bit of bad news underneath. It makes you wonder if going back a few episodes, if they tried to make this announcement on a Friday afternoon.
I was just about
they
to
didn't
ask.
actually this time. They didn't actually this time. So it's interesting to see how they're planning on doing business. I mean, this is the first major time that they have flip-flopped on an issue, and Well, we're only a couple months in, so we're gonna have to buckle in and see what's gonna happen over the next few months.
All right. Well, speaking of tax dollars and tax dollars being reallocated, the federal government is pressing ahead with its tax reforms towards small businesses. We talked about this a little bit, a couple episodes about how massive it was going to be, but this is more of a general overview of what is going on with the tax reforms. So, back in July, Finance Minister Bill Morneau announced a plan to close 3 loopholes in the tax system, loopholes as he calls them. He says these would have allowed high-income earning business owners to avoid higher tax rates. The loopholes focus on so-called income sprinkling, methods of converting income into dividends and capital gains, and limiting passive business income taxation. So income sprinkling allows a business owner to divert some of their income to lower-earning family members by paying them wages, salaries, or dividends. A corporation can also convert income into capital gains by selling securities, stocks, or properties that were received above the purchase price, and these are taxed at a normally low rate. Passive income tax refers to the income earned from an investment portfolio rather than day-to-day operations of a business, because the money will just sit in a corporation. So effectively what can happen here is that the money can be classed as an investment inside this corporation, and it's not necessarily used for day-to-day operations. It just grows and matures over time. So in episode 33 of The Right Side, we talked about the magnitude of small business in Canada and what they provide to our economy. 70% of families in Canada receive dividends, so salaries, funds, other benefits from a small business, and have an income below $200,000. This, of course, means that these changes will be affecting the middle class, which are the very people that these tax loopholes are supposedly being closed to protect. According to the Financial Post, quote, under the new rules, passive income could now be taxed at an almost confiscatory rate of over 70%. With Parliament back in session, this has been the opposition's focus this entire week, highlighting the above points to the government and to the national media. But still, even as mentioned on episode 33 of The Right Side, the media is not talking about the sheer magnitude of the potential impact that this could have on the Canadian economy. Jack Mintz of the Financial Post was back again this week with an article entitled, Ottawa's Tax Reforms Are About Feeding the Spending Beast, Not Fairness. The article nicely outlines the nature of our tax system, where government takes away from the success stories in our economy, but doesn't necessarily share any of the burden of the risk of being an entrepreneur or starting a new business. The first example of this is our income tax system, which affects a higher tax rate for those who are successful because they ultimately bring more money in. The second example is stated in the premise that the government gains heavily when a business is successful, as illustrated by point 1, but the government shares little to no burden of running the business, any of the risks involved, paying wages, other expenses, or even family housing, as is the case for some small businesses run out of a home. The Financial Post piece also outlines how these structures of government that already exist, businesses are already taxed at a higher burden and rate rather than an individual who's just paying a conventional income tax. Essentially, a small business has more people to look out for than someone who just earns an income from a small business. So if you're, in a sense, providing livelihood for 50 people, you have a larger burden than just the one person who is working there. It ends with the conclusion that the new tax proposals provide no relief for unfair taxation that would ultimately lower tax revenue. And there's also no provisions for loss relief and no provisions for better income averaging and no plans to reduce tax rates for risky businesses. So think of businesses in a brand new sector that are just starting up. Say an entrepreneur tax credit, that would be a way of reducing this risk. And it also rightly highlights that taxes will just increase across the board from this, and new revenues will strictly be going to the government expenditures rather than, going to actually help out the middle class, as in the article's title, just feeding the spending beast. What's more, though, is that this isn't covered in the national media, is that Jean Chrétien's former finance minister, John Manley, has said that tax changes, anti-rich rhetoric, have already inspired big fish to leave. Manley has also said that these proposals affect higher income Canadians, and they have been vilified as a result. He also brings up the pledge that Trudeau would be, quote, the unifier, and he was bringing people together. Manley further highlights that one example of this is in his Business Council of Canada, who has a client who has already decided to leave Canada with billions of dollars, largely citing the proposed changes to the estate tax and estate planning. And this person, or business rather, said, keeping the business in the family would have resulted in a big tax hit. Manley's group echoes the piece from the Financial Post, and that they want to see the unintended consequences of this plan hashed out before it's further debated and implemented. The current consultation phase for this new tax policy will end on October 2nd, and ultimately the media has done a poor job of highlighting the magnitude of these changes, both in terms on a monetary sense and on a per business basis, but also the amount of money that would be discouraged from being invested into Canadian businesses.
Yeah, it's something that I think I've noticed, especially over the last week or two, is that they've been highlighting a lot of stories about the tax changes, but they haven't really mentioned how many people are going to be affected by this. Like, so many people are employed by small businesses that would be affected under these changes, and if those tax rates go up, they're just going to push up prices. They're going to push up um, wages, and wages are not going to go up because of the increased burden that's going to be on small business owners and the increased risk that's going to be on this. So wages aren't going to go up, and also the prices are just going to go up instead, because every time that there is a change on this that will cost business owners more money, they end up just having to push the price on to the consumer. This happens every time the minimum wage goes up,
Yeah.
and it also happens every time there's a change in the tax code.
Yeah, I mean, they could ultimately decide to take on more of the tax burden themselves, but you don't see that unless it's in a sector of the economy where the items absolutely need to be sold to the consumer. It's going to be far easier to pass it on. And what's more is you don't necessarily need to implement these changes to have an effect on the economy. You just need to talk about them, and you will start having that effect on the economy in terms of investment. And it can be seen in the sense of fairness. And if you were talking about large corporations, the Walmarts of the world, for example, then people might see it that way. But you got to remember that this is talking about small business, and upwards of 70% of families and Canadians in Canada are somewhat intertwined with a small business. So this is going to affect 70% of Canadians when you split it all apart. And that's the part that's being missed here. So it's just bad news all around, and we'll have to see what the final proposal looks like. But if it goes in as it is right now, that's not going to look good for the Canadian investment climate.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right. We mentioned we're going to absurd.
Yeah, so we've kind of highlighted a few politics stories in the last couple of stories here. So I'm going to move away from politics and just go straight based on media. So the firing line segment, of course, if you're just joining us for the first time this week, is a segment that we use to try and highlight the most absurd or most sensationalized or most biased media story that we can see out there, and to just try and highlight the problems that we have in our day-to-day media whenever we're going out and trying to consume news. So let's paint a picture. You're an aspiring filmmaker from Victoria, BC, and you're creating a documentary about what's being called a group of comedians being pushed to the limits in the hopes of mounting a unique underground comedy show. So you're going to be screening the film at the 7th or possibly the 8th best film theater in town, and not really many people know or care about it. So how do you make a living by getting people to hear about you? Well, there's basically two options. You can either market the hell out of it in local circles, or you can maybe talk to some media outlets, try and get some radio or newspaper coverage, and tell all your friends to get the word of mouth out there so that people are excited about your film. Or there's option two, which is to create an outrageous fake publicity stunt, in this particular case an illegal and discriminatory publicity stunt, and that to get people enraged and for the media to blow up about it. And that still gets people talking about your film. Now, they say that and there's no such thing as bad publicity because any publicity is good publicity. But in some senses, I think that might actually not be true. So, of course, option two is what Shiraz Higgins, who is a film director of a web series documentary called Building the Room, this is what he decided upon. He created what he called justice pricing, and he was going to charge what he referred to as cisgender white males $20, while everyone else was being charged $10 because he wanted to base it on the purchasing power of individual groups and price discrimination. So Higgins said, this is not a publicity stunt originally, and he was adding that organizers are pushing forward because we believe it is an important piece of overall conversation that is happening in society right now. Higgins said that the justice pricing was not a stunt, but a way to spark a conversation about income inequality. It was never intended to be a national conversation, Higgins said. It's a local screening featuring an unknown cast of comedians from an unknown director in a little-known city. For some reason, the national media thought it was a story that needed to be run far and wide.
Can we explain what a cisgendered white male is first?
Oh yeah, let's refer to that. So cisgender is basically someone who refers to themselves as the gender that they were born with. So if you're born a male with, say male characteristics, then if you refer to yourself as a male, then then you would be basically called a cisgender male. So this is what he's referring to. It's a term that's come up in the last couple of years as a way for people in the LGBTQ community to refer to other people who refer to themselves as what they were at birth. So back to the story here. We've got Higgins, and originally he didn't call himself by his real name. He actually referred all press inquiries and questions and did news interviews with a Gmail address with a fake PR pseudonym called Sid Mohammed, which Higgins, who is white, he decided upon using the name Sid Mohammed because using an Islamic-sounding name would create more controversy, and he later mentioned that he received death threats to the Sid Mohammed Gmail address. So according to the Times columnist, Higgins has actually been involved in this type of thing before. A few years ago, he invited reporters to meet a Salvation Army youth pastor who was allegedly endorsing gay marriage. It turned out that the pastor was an actor being paid by Higgins, and the ensuing coverage actually appeared in Higgins' film. And of course, the initial story about the justice pricing blew up on local social media. It was all over Victoria community message boards, it was on Twitter and Facebook, and the mainstream media also picked up on it as well, with outlets like the CBC, the Globe and Mail, and various other Canadian press papers like the Vancouver Province and the Victoria Times Colonist. So most had an earlier version talking about Sid Mohammed when he was being the PR person, and then when the pseudonym was revealed, some rushed to issue corrections and called Higgins a fake. So here's the thing. There's multiple issues at play here. The first is obviously Shiraz Higgins, who used a discriminatory tactic which is prohibited under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and then he tried to escape blowback by using a fake Islamic name to generate further controversy. I mean, I understand. It's kind of hard to get publicity about local arts productions, and it's hard to get your name out there. So I kind of get why he resulted to use a publicity stunt to get people talking, but he kind of went about it the completely wrong way, and then he went to the media afterwards to try and get sympathy for his death threats. I mean, and right now he's trying to laugh off the whole issue as a joke, but it's actually really a serious issue. But the second major issue of this is that the media being concentrated in such few sources means that if there is something wrong with the story, such as the fake Sid Mohammed, it's going to get republished all over the country. And if there's no actual fact-checking, then the whole story can end up being wrong. And it leads to an actual problem with what we call fake news, and it actually lessens the reputation and credibility of journalism as a whole. And third, when the guy you're writing about turns to have bamboozled you and your reader base so fully, you shouldn't really be writing articles which are sympathizing and promoting him. Instead, it's better to issue corrections and then not give him any more airtime. And lastly, of course, news outlets really need to stop sensationalizing headlines, especially when it's a nothing story such as this. It's a tactic that's used to garner an emotional response, to get you to keep reading, and to get personally involved in the story. And it's
Clicks,
really not worth it
likes,
in this day and age.
ad views.
Exactly. And of course, we at the right side will continue to deconstruct the media sensationalism as we always do, and we'll give you, the listeners, nothing but the news.
We don't normally talk about fake news here. And it's not every day that, like you said, multiple publications in Canada publish a story that is fake, but completely trip over themselves to issue corrections. It's almost as though they weren't watching where they were going and just kept stepping forward and weren't paying attention that these things were all related, and they just kept writing stories about this. So, it's cases like this that really torpedo the credibility of the media, and this is not something that's gonna go away quick in terms of raising their credibility. So
yeah, and look at this particular guy. I mean, obviously this worked.
This
He
was
got what he
one
wanted.
person.
This was one person. He got what he wanted. He got national media attention. He even got international media attention, like places from Britain, from Europe, from Asia, from the United States. They were all reporting on this from a little nothing production in Victoria, and it doesn't make any sense as to how it got blown up so much, and it's all because of the media just kind of running with the story with a sensationalist headline, and
Not fact
they
checking
all
along
kind
the
of went
way.
with. Yeah, exactly. And it was almost quite clearly a publicity stunt just reading through the original article. You could tell that something was off about it, but they still ran with it, and they kept running with it because afterwards, after they found out about the pseudonym, they had to create a whole bunch of new articles about it. So that raises his profile even more. So now people are talking
So
about
the
this
media
guy.
dug a hole, and then they dug it deeper.
Exactly, and that's what they seem to do whenever they make something wrong. They try and make it better, but they end up just making it worse.
And if we noticed this and this got out and this was published, you got to wonder what kind of editing they got going on at these publications, right?
Exactly. And it's just something that's going to, lower the trust of everyone in journalism when you see your trusted news outlets running with a story like this when it's obviously fake, and it just creates the problem of who do you trust with your news nowadays? You have to really go everywhere to try and find what's actually happening.
It also allows the label of fake news to be spread a lot easier than it should be, and you don't want to apply that fake news label maliciously, but in this case it is truly warranted.
Indeed.
All right, well, what do we got for word of the week this week?
So word of the week this week kind of refers to our earlier stories there, and that's taxation. And taxation, of course, refers to the practice of a government collecting money from its citizens to pay for public services, such as roads, water lines, electricity, hospitals, public parks, and many other different things. So I think taxation, we could see it as something that's necessary in today's society, to create society, to keep it running properly, and to make sure that everything's running smoothly. But I think where a lot of people disagree is the level of taxation and how much there should
and the allocation.
Should be. And the allocation of that taxation, and how much how much control we have over that as citizens, and how much input we have in the decision-making process.
Yeah, and when it comes down to it, it's a pure matter of allocation when it comes to your story in BC. When it comes to the small businesses in Canada, it's the amount and how fairly or unfairly that's applied. And, you might think that on its own, taxation is a relatively simple thing. It's a way of funding the government and giving money to the government to ensure that they can provide services. But we also need to remember that taxation has been the start of revolutionary wars in the past. It was unfair taxation from England that caused the initial 13 colonies in the United States to get upset. So taxation on its own, in the 21st century might seem like a simple and mundane thing that we just have to deal with. But when it comes down to it, taxation should be smart and it should be used sensibly. So not for funding of political parties like we had in your BC story. And it should be fair and transparent, which is kind of the opposite of the way we're going with the small business tax story. So taxation, very important.
Indeed.
All right, I think we're done. As we said, this was going to end with a bit of an absurd note. Hopefully, we brought it back to ground level with the word of the week in taxation. But if not, there's always this potential to have a story like that on the right side. If you want to find more about past stories on that same kind of absurd level, you can find it at rightsidenews.ca. Full show notes are there. We're also on Twitter and Facebook at RightSideCA. And if you want to subscribe on iTunes or YouTube, that's rightsidenews.ca/iTunes or /YouTube for those various mediums. So with that being said, we'll see you next week for another episode of The Right Side.
And as always, we will be here to give you the news. And so we will see you next week.